All right, so we have an increase in investment demand. So the first thing we always do is we go ahead and draw our initial graph. So we have real interest rate on our y-axis. You have quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis. Then we have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds and an upward sloping supply of loanable funds. And then we're going to have an equilibrium real interest rate, and we're going to have an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds here. Now, if there is an increase in investment demand, that means people are borrowing in order to invest. So that is going to increase the demand for loanable funds, thus shifting it to the right. So we go ahead and draw our arrow here and our new demand for loanable funds, which we will call DLF1. And now we can see what happened to our equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. So our new real interest rate we'll call R1. We can see our real interest rate went up after the shift. And our quantity of loanable funds went up as well from Q to Q1. Okay, so that equilibrium real interest rate went up, the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds went up. So the last thing you have to do is you need to go ahead and tell me what happened to and write down what happened to that real interest rate and what happened to the quantity of loanable funds. So your real interest rate went up and your quantity of loanable funds also went up. So after that increase in demand for loanable funds, your equilibrium real interest rate went up and your quantity of loanable funds also went up. All right, so you're good to go there. All right, now we're going to take a look at the other side of the loanable funds market, which is the supply of loanable funds. So remember that the supply of loanable funds is equal to saving. Saving affects the supply of loanable funds. Saving is thus the determinant of the supply of loanable funds. More saving, more supply of loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right. Less saving, less supply of loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the left. So here's some examples. Let's say the government is running a budget surplus. That means the government is actually saving money. So a government budget surplus is going to be equal to more saving. That's going to mean more supply of loanable funds. That's going to imply that the supply for loanable funds is going to shift to the right, which implies that the real interest rate is going to fall, and we'll see that on our graph in a minute. If we had a decrease in consumers' marginal propensity to save, that means there's less saving. Okay, people are not saving as much of each dollar. So that means less supply of loanable funds, which implies that the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the left, which implies that your real interest rate is going to go up. So let's take a look at some graphs here. Let's look at an increase in the supply of loanable funds. So we're going to have a real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis. We have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds, upward sloping supply of loanable funds. And that creates an equilibrium real interest rate, which we'll call R, and an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, which we'll call Q. An increase in the supply of loanable funds is going to shift it to the right from SLF to SLF1. So where SLF1 meets demand for loanable funds, you'll see we have a new real interest rate, R1, and a new quantity of loanable funds, which is Q1. So the supply of loanable funds shifted to the right, which pushed the real interest rate down, and the quantity of loanable funds up. Now let's go ahead and look at a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. So we're going to have real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis, downward sloping demand for loanable funds, upward sloping supply of loanable funds. We have an equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. Decrease in the supply of loanable funds is going to shift it to the left from SLF to SLF1. You can see with SLF1 meets DLF, you have a new equilibrium real interest rate, which is R1, and new equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, which is Q1. So when the supply of loanable funds shifted to the left, that implied that your real interest rate went up and your quantity of loanable funds went down. All right, some final thoughts on loanable funds. The loanable funds market determines the real interest rate. The loanable funds market relates saving and borrowing. Changes in saving and borrowing are going to create changes in loanable funds, and that's going to change the real interest rate. When the government does fiscal policy, it will affect the loanable funds market. So when the U.S. government does fiscal policy is how the president and Congress use government spending and taxation to affect aggregate demand in an economy. So when the president and the Congress do fiscal policy and they change the level of government spending and they change the amount of taxes, that's going to affect if the government is borrowing or whether it is saving. Thus, it is going to affect the loanable funds market. And then changes in the real interest rate are going to affect gross private investment. And we'll talk about this more, but if you have a higher real interest rate, that means it is more expensive to borrow and invest. Thus, you're going to have less gross private investment. A lower real interest rate means it's going to be less expensive to borrow and invest, which means you're going to have more gross private investment. All right, so let's do our assessment here. We're going to do a couple of loanable funds graphs. So for number one, we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds, if there is an increase in government deficit spending. So go ahead and give me a fully labeled supply and demand for loanable funds graph. Then go ahead and shift either the supply or the demand for loanable funds. Mark your new equilibriums, then tell me what happened to your new the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds after that shift. Did it go up or down? Number two, we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds if there is an increase in a society's marginal propensity to save. So once again, full graph, shift either the demand or supply of loanable funds. What happened to the real interest rate? What happened to the quantity of loanable funds? So we need to pause this. That's fine. Otherwise, we're moving on. So for the summary, in a paragraph, we're going to describe what we have learned today. And I will check these tomorrow. Hope you have a good one, and I'll see you tomorrow.